about the Australia-India relationship, looking at its prospects going forward, and what is a rather confounding at some level, incredibly exciting, because you go to bed at night and you wake up in the morning and everything has changed, geopolitical moment. So there's lots for us to talk about, and I'd like to thank you for being here to talk with us this afternoon, and to the Australian High Commission for giving us this opportunity, and also to our wonderful esteemed panelists, friends and family of CPR, who have agreed to be here to respond to Dr. Varghese's remarks. So we'll start today's proceedings with some opening comments from Dr. Peter Varghese. He needs no introduction to this gathering, but I'll go through the formalities nonetheless. He is, as all his friends in India know, the former Australian High Commissioner to India, and he's currently the Chancellor of the University of Queensland. So Dr. Varghese, over to you for your opening remarks.
Well, thank you very much, Yamini, and good afternoon to everyone. Can I say how delighted I am to be back at CPR, this time in person, having delivered the lecture virtually back in March. I've always had a tremendous admiration for the work that CPR does, and have a very high regard for it. And can I also acknowledge my good friend Chancellor in the audience today, from whom I have learned a great deal, and whose most recent book on China and India I found absolutely fascinating. And the Australian High Commissioner, Barry O'Farrell, who's presiding over a particularly high moment in Australia-India relations. The relationship seemed to have improved remarkably after I left. I don't know if it's cause and effect. And Yamini, thank you also for reuniting me with three very old friends in Anil, Suhasini, and Pratap. So I'm looking forward to a very good discussion. So I just wanted to say a few context-setting words about the Australia-India relationship. And I really want to talk about it at the points of intersection with the economy, with geopolitics, and with the multilateral challenges that we face. So let me start on the economic side. When I was asked to do some work on an India economic strategy back in 2018, and put out a medium to long-term strategy, I said at the time that it was driven by really three things. One was an appreciation of the scale of the Indian economy and how that was going to only get larger. An understanding of the structural complementarity between our two economies. In other words, how supply and demand is likely to work bilaterally as the Indian economy grows. And thirdly, the imperative to diversify Australia's trade and investment relationships. And I think by and large, those three drivers still hold true. Certainly, the diversification objective, if anything, has been intensified as a result of geopolitics, and the complementarity, I think, is structural, so it's hardly likely to disappear in 2 or 3 years. The scale, I think, is still what will characterize the future of the Indian economy, but I think all of our economies are now entering into a slightly different phase and a slightly different dynamic of growth. And in some ways, this is a combination of a COVID effect and shifts in geoeconomics. So you could say COVID is 2 lost years, and then we'll all get back to where we were in 2019. And maybe that might have been the case if we didn't have these shifts in geoeconomics. But I think the combination of the two has meant a different type of dynamic now playing out. We're operating in an environment where globalization is going to be much slower. I don't think it can disappear, because the logic of globalization is a certain irreducible minimum to it. But certainly we've probably seen peak globalization. Secondly, we are clearly seeing a selective decoupling between the United States and China, and that is going to have flow-on consequences for the global economy. I mean, already we're looking at a global outlook where the three major engines of growth, US, China, and Europe, for different reasons, but also some common reasons, are slowing. And you've got a increased interest in and psychological attachment to concepts of self-reliance. This is partly anxiety about the vulnerability of global supply chains. It's probably an instinctive appeal for having more control yourself as a country than you might otherwise have had. And to what extent self-reliance slides across into a new form of protectionism, I think is going to be one of the challenges we face. So that's the sort of background to where the economic relationship will grow. Now, I think the approach we've taken, which is to focus on sectors and states, still is the right way to do it. We've updated the economic strategy more recently to address some areas like critical minerals and space, which weren't as prominent when the report was being written. But I think the idea of thinking about the Indian economy at the state and regional level still makes a lot of sense for Australia. The idea that education, agribusiness, resources, and tourism are likely to be the sort of main sectors supplemented by a very strong emphasis on services trade, including health and financial services. I think all of that remains the case. We've now seen the free trade agreement agenda move forward through the interim agreement, and I think both sides are keen for final agreement to be concluded. I don't think that's going to be easy personally. I think the whole thing about doing an interim agreement is that what's left over are the really, really hard things. And it's hard to sort of get across the line, but I was pleasantly surprised with how comprehensive the interim agreement was. So maybe I'll be pleasantly surprised at how soon the final agreement can be concluded. So that's the economics. On the geopolitics, let me just say a couple of things. You know, Australia has grown up as a nation where it has been always a partner in primacy. And by that, I mean, we have had first the United Kingdom, which was a hegemon of sorts in its day. And then we had the United States as our primary strategic partner, and a period of American primacy, which from an Australian perspective worked terrifically well, not just in terms of our national security, but also in terms of the way in which the American strategic umbrella in Asia provided an environment for economic growth. Now we're going to have to learn to navigate a very different world because it's going to be a world of multipolarity. So that easy reassurance that we had from having a close strategic partnership with primary strategic power in the world is going to fundamentally shift. And over time, what we will be seeing is the creation of a new strategic equilibrium in the Indo-Pacific, which is going to look very differently. You have China's ambition to become the predominant power. You have an American determination to remain the predominant power, and you have other countries of substance and strategic weight, such as Japan and India, Indonesia, all of whom will be looking for a place in this new strategic equilibrium. I think inevitably we're going to be operating in a more complex balance of power arrangement than we've been used to, and which Australia has really very little experience in navigating. the paradox of the US position, in my view, is that its strategic objective is to retain primacy, but its strategy ultimately is a sublimation of primacy, because it's a recognition that in order for America to protect its interests, it needs to do it in collaboration with other countries to provide a sufficient counterbalance to China. And so you have the Quad, which brings together Japan, India, the US, and Australia as one of those mechanisms. I think the Quad will only be part of this evolving reach for strategic equilibrium. You have AUKUS as another component of it. And AUKUS is not a straightforward strategic arrangement. I mean, AUKUS at the end of the day is more a leap in technology than it is a leap in strategy, but it's a part of this emerging new strategic equilibrium. And for Australia, I think, one of the key questions is going to be how we structure our own defense thinking and strategic policy to give us a reasonable measure of confidence that we are able to defend our interests and to defend our country in the event that things turn bad for us. And personally, I think this is going to, at some stage, require us to re-examine the balance between forward defense and the defense of Australia in Australian strategic thinking. Australia has always had an attachment to forward defense, by which I mean the best way to protect the continent is to fight your battles a long way from shore. And the trouble with forward defense is that if you overemphasize it, your capacity to actually defend the continent becomes weaker. So we need to shift the balance more towards a defense of Australia capability, and the government's just announced a force structure, force posture review, which I think we'll have to come to grips with this. And amongst other things, it will have to examine whether long-range nuclear submarines are, one, obtainable and realistic in a time frame, and secondly, where does it fit in with a revised force structure. The other complication, obviously, for all of us in the region is the China-Russia relationship and what that means. What does it signify? What's its durability? Is it more than an opportunistic coupling? How do we deal with a partnership with no limits, although it seems to me no longer was it, as soon as it was announced, it started to look as if it had limits to it. And I think it'll be a challenge for India. I mean, I think the China-Russia relationship will raise some challenges for India. I mean, put it its most simple, how does India continue to work with the United States to constrain China while Russia works with China to constrain the United States? Now, I'm not saying it's a circle that can't be squared, but it certainly, I think, will test Indian diplomacy. On the multilateral side, I think in the end, whether or not we can succeed in finding again the common ground that you need for multilateral institutions to have some effect and impact, and I'm thinking also here particularly regional institutions, whether it's the East Asia Summit or APEC or the ARF, whether we can find sufficient common ground will ultimately turn on whether the strategy of both engaging China and constraining China is a workable strategy, or whether the weight you put on constraining makes engaging next to impossible. Now, I happen to think that engaging constraints is probably the most sensible way of trying to think about how you deal with both your common interests with China, but also your very serious anxieties and concerns about China's behavior. Economic integration is going to be, I think, a very, very difficult challenge for regional institutions. I mean, the history of our region, whether we talk about the Asia-Pacific or the Indo-Pacific, has been a story of economic opening, trade and investment liberalization, incremental, sometimes one step forward, two steps back, but the trend line has certainly been in the direction of openness. Now, for all sorts of reasons, including that sort of allure of self-reliance, I think we're all going to have to learn to re-prosecute the case for an open economy. We're going to have to find a new vocabulary which fits this new psychological angst about self-reliance in an uncertain world, and how do you open your economy against that. So let me finish my remarks by saying that I think the underlying economic and geopolitical trends are going to continue to bring our relationship, Australia and India, closer together. I think our diaspora component in Australia, 700,000 strong now, a diaspora that will be more and more politically active, is going to add further depth and texture to that relationship. But I'll just end by making this comment. The deepest relationships between countries are when values and interests combine. You can have very substantial transactional relationships. But if you want a deep partnership, I think you need to have a combination of values and interests. Now, Australia's thinking about India as a partner with whom we want to deepen the relationship has been with an India that is a secular liberal democracy. And that has enabled a combination of interests and values to combine easily and neatly in the way in which we engage with each other. India's ability to hang on to that defining characteristic, I think, is quite an important part of the future of our relationship. And that's entirely something, obviously for India to work out. And I know India in the past has had moments when its secular liberal democratic character has been tested. And as I've said in a couple of public remarks, I've always thought that whatever's wrong with Indian democracy can be fixed by what's right with Indian democracy. And I very much hope that that remains the case. So I'll leave my remarks there.
Thank you very much for that absolutely wonderful masterclass on the realities of our geopolitics and the challenges of our economics. And I think much of what you describe in terms of the tensions even within Australia resonate very much in the kind of tensions that India is confronting as well. And your last comment about values and interests really is at the heart of what ought to shape our foreign policy and what shapes our relationships with the world. So there's lots for our panel discussion, panelists to talk about. Pratap, maybe I can start with you. Just by virtue of introduction, Pratap Mehta is Honorary Senior Fellow at CPR and the Laurence S. Rockefeller Professor of Distinguished Teaching at Princeton University. Pratap, both to respond broadly to Dr. Varghese's remarks, just laying out the geopolitical, geoeconomics context and the multilateral relationship, but also in particular, I think, as he described, this challenge of engaging China, containing China, constraining China, which I think shapes both the internal tensions in many countries. India is not unusual there either, but also the nature of our bilateral relationships as they're evolving too. So just your thoughts on that and how this feeds into the larger, his last remark that at the heart of the bilateral ought to be this combine of values and interests.
Thank you so much. And Peter is always a tough act to follow, not only as a fine diplomat, but we miss your intellectual presence in Delhi. It was always fun to have great analytical conversations. So maybe I'll put a couple of thoughts on the table, I think, for us to think about. I pretty much agree with everything you say. So it's sort of difficult to sort of disagree. So but maybe draw you out in the logic of what you were saying a little. And let me begin with a big question, which is, So if one observes international alignments at the moment and this experimentation with different kinds of coalitions, Quad, AUKUS, suppose one takes a skeptical view of them and saying, a lot of this feels like, that old line from Yes Minister, something must be done. This is something is being done, right? None of this activity is actually confronting the two core scenarios that we have with China. Maybe three scenarios. One, as you have said in one of your lectures, if China were a liberal democracy, we might worry about it less. Or at least Australia might worry about it less, because you think that would entail a certain kind of approach to international order. The second is China gets more assertive, and which it has. And certainly the form that assertion takes is an expression of its nationalism and national interests, where it is willing to countenance a relatively high price for pursuing them, right? Like maybe Russia and Ukraine, just to take that analogy. China is also nuclear weapon power. And in the event that China would take that back, would the rest of the world's response kind of be like what we've done with Russia in some senses, where there's very clear limits being set even by the United States? You can arm Ukraine, let the Ukrainians fight. But fundamentally, you do not have the resources or capacity to engage in the project of denial to China, right? All these alliances are premised on this fundamental fact that if we put our resources together, if we have a forward defense policy, somehow the strategy where you raise China's costs will be sufficient to produce optimal denial. Right? Now, it seems to me that there's a kind of tension here, because on the one hand, all of this is assuming the worst about China to begin with, that China has now reached a stage of assertion where both its regional ambitions, but if not its regional ambitions, certainly its national ambitions in terms of Taiwan, others. Is all of this really adding up to a kind of coherent strategy? Because that's the United States' posture in some sense, right? That we work with all these alliances so that we can successfully prosecute a denial strategy. And given that that denial strategy has pretty much not worked anywhere, not even in Russia, how likely is it to work with China? So that's a question, your assessment. The flip side of that question, that suppose China's trajectory is not in this corner solution that I've just painted, that there is actually room for maneuver, that China is likely to be more assertive, but actually not take a radical precipitating action that would be upend the Asian order. In those circumstances, it seems to be that the biggest risk to the world is the United States misjudging China and overreacting. And if that is the case, it is one of the roles that India and Australia now need to think of performing, is actually mobilizing the rest of the world to act as an appropriate restraint on the United States in the eventuality that there is actually some room for maneuver with China. So you see the kind of the dilemma we are in, right? Which is, if China is very aggressive, do we have the means for a strategy of denial? If it isn't aggressive, right, then isn't as much part of our problem making sure the Americans don't push China in a corner such that a precipitating action goes out of it. And arguably, Ambassador Southern's written a column today. Arguably, the United States is slipping down that path. And so one of the better strategies ideologically for Australia would be other ambition in this relationship is not just to position itself against China, but to actually act as a moderating influence on almost all the big powers. Because the threat to the world order or the risk of war can actually come from any of the major powers, not just China. And in a sense, it's welcoming Australia to non-alignment 2.0. Kidding, pushing. So that's I think one of, at a kind of the geostrategic. There's a couple of other questions which maybe we come to later. But.
Sure. We'll take a first round of comments and then ask you to respond before we go to the next round. But perhaps maybe I can bring you in here. In fact, to respond in some ways to the provocation that Pratap has presented as well, and the overall framing that Dr. Varghese has presented, both on Chinese aggressions and potentially needing to contain the United States, and where Australia and India, for that matter, ought to sit. And also your reflections on the role of the AUKUS, the Quad, the new alliances in this.
Normally, when a journalist is invited to one of these sessions, one assumes I'm bringing up the people-to-people ties and all the rest. But it's obvious that, as I think the High Commissioner said, famously, there's a panda in the room. And it is therefore necessary to move from the idea, I think, a former High Commissioner had of the 3 C's of the India-Australia relationship. And I see students over there, so you should know the 3 C's are essentially cricket, Commonwealth, and common language. This represented the first maybe 50 years of India-Australia ties, and cricket really dominated everything else. We moved then to, I think, the 4 Ds. Was it more recently? Democracy, diaspora, dosti, and defense. Because defense has increased 4 times. Look, when it comes to the idea of
Now the 1C.
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, I was going to make that point. But there was another C that came in, and I think in the last couple of years has, in a sense, made us understand how our relationship might look in the future, and that is post-COVID. COVID made us all really take a much harder look at whom we are. And not only look into the mirror, but look into the so-called relationships we have, the so-called friendships we have. And not everything we saw really brought us, life. It's now possible a year later to kind of look back and think the world will go back to how it was. But we learned some tough lessons during COVID. One of them was that we do, in fact, in a real sense of crisis, move to what Ian Bremmer called the G0 world, where it's each country for himself or herself. And Australia, by its very, very strict border closure, disappointed many. And I'm not saying anything that the Indian High Commissioner to Australia didn't say, but essentially the kind of loss students face, which was a really strong relationship between India and Australia, taught us something about ourselves. India's, has always been very proud of its medical system, of its health system, but the Delta virus really laid us low and showed us exactly who we were and what our capabilities were in the face of, a few days of oxygen shortages, for example. And most of all, we learned something about the leaders of the world, if you like, and how they reacted to it. You have a country like the United States that essentially only began to help others after it had really tried to take care of itself. Almost, there were times when they ordered supplies that were meant for another country to actually be diverted to the United States. So there was a sense that the US would take care of itself before it took care of others. There was China that didn't even warn the world about what was coming its way, despite the fact that the virus definitely originated in Wuhan. Did not really help the world in dealing with this crisis either, even though they had a kind of head start on the rest of us. And then closed its borders in the most draconian way, if you like. And now you have Russia that has come out of this crisis, the COVID crisis, the economic crisis, everything else every country is dealing with. A country like Sri Lanka didn't just collapse; its economy didn't collapse overnight. It collapsed because of a number of reasons. One was COVID, the end of tourism, other sources of income, but it was very much that the Russia-Ukraine war, or the Russian invasion of Ukraine, brought about with an energy crisis and a food security crisis that countries can't deal with. So you see a country like Russia equally unmindful of the kind of trauma countries have been through COVID, reacting in this way, which basically says, I'll take care of my interests first as well. So I think in that scenario, India and Australia have to face up to what we're looking at. And that is unfortunately a leaderless world, a world in which the United Nations, if it was or at some point the most important umbrella organization for the world, has not really played the role it should, and it probably needs a real reform. And a world where each of us will have to work something of a coalition on the basis of shared interests at various times. And I'm not even sure that shared values count anymore, because shared values would mean something, except in practical terms, we're dealing with people who don't share the same values as us, sometimes more closely than we do with others. So I think even this idea of a D10 or the democracy 10, the coalition of the concert of democracies, these are all questions we have to ask, because who's judging what is a democracy? Does democracy just basically mean that a country holds elections and so forth? And Peter put it very nicely when he said that India's values include being a democracy, being a pluralistic democracy, a secular democracy, an inclusive democracy. And many of us have questioned just how far we can keep those descriptions going. So that's really the second part of what India and Australia have to come together with. And the third, when we look at the challenge from China, it's not a uniform challenge for us. We can put it into three real baskets, and both India and Australia suffer from the same issues with China. One is a bilateral issue with China. India's had very, very serious problems at the line of actual control, PLA transgressions for 2 years now, still no real breakthrough in the kind of resolution of it. Australia has had a big issue with China when it comes to its economic coercion. So there are those bilateral issues with China that they're dealing with. The second is really how they're dealing with the maritime challenge of China. India is feeling it very much in the Indian Ocean region. The fact that India has to protest with Sri Lanka, a country that at this point one would think we have the best possible relationship with, having spent the last 6 months really working together with their economic crisis, has to actually protest with Sri Lanka about the appearance of a Chinese research and satellite tracking vessel. So we are seeing India being challenged in its maritime sphere. Australia, of course, is dealing with it in its own way. You have, in a sense, much closer maritime ties to deal with over there, and the Taiwan crisis will bring those to the fore. And how AUKUS is energized as a result of what we're seeing today. This evening, we've seen missiles being fired as well. Is going to be a question. And the third sphere, where both India and Australia are feeling challenged from China, is in their own regions, which is essentially SAARC and FIPIC, if you like. And both have tried in their various ways, even as a part of the Quad, to help countries in their regions keep away from falling into debt traps, falling into easy kind of resources coming their way, and actually look for more sustainable, transparent, and other kind of partnerships that we can actually sustain over a certain period of time. So I would say that we do have all of these challenges in common in a sense, but eventually we're going to deal with them very differently. Why do I say that? And I think Yamini pointed to it and Pratap pointed to it. We will deal with it differently for the simple reason that we don't have the same view of the world. Australia is part of an alliance, is part of the military alliance. India is not part of the military alliance. Not only is it notionally called a non-aligned country, the fact is that whatever India does, and I know I get laughed out when I say this, but I'm just going by the actual numbers of things we do with each of these groupings, whatever India might do with Quad or IPEF, or even the G7 outreach that we just saw, it equally does the same things with SCO, with BRICS. There's a vaccine research center over here, there's a vaccine initiative here, there are exercises over here, there are other exercises over here. So in terms of both theory and practice, India is not part of the same constellation that Australia is. And I think the second part of that is really that the economic balance of the region is something we look at Of course, Peter has been the architect and father in a sense of seeing India and Australia walk a certain way, and it's quite miraculous that we actually now have a preliminary, economic cooperation agreement between us. But there's much more to the economic balance of the region that we haven't really gotten to. And that is that's not a hole that's being filled by our alliance in Quad. So far, we've seen a lot of alphabet soups coming out of this arrangement, but it hasn't added up to a real counter or alternative to changing the economic balance of the region, whether it is IPEP, whether it's America's Blue Dot Network, or I think there's a new Blue Pacific or the Pacific Waters Network, and all the rest of that. So eventually, the challenge for India and Australia will be as two democracies with diverse, plural populations to come together, two regional powers, which desire to lift, all boats in a sense in their respective regions, and two, I would say, strategic partners of the United States, but equally very, very large trading partners of China that have to somehow come to terms with this world. Finally, and I'm glad Peter brought it up, but I do think that any friendship that develops between us will have to be the product of honesty. And just as 14 years ago, I remember covering it, so I'm probably older than a lot of people in the room, but 14 years ago, India was able to show a mirror to its Australian friends when there were attacks on Indian students in Australia. And there was a sense that, look, whatever the problem is, this is something that one has to deal with, one has to come close to. I think it is also necessary for Australia to be equally honest with India, instead of celebrating India as a perfect democracy, as we sometimes hear it do, actually point out that there are problems and concerns about the way we're progressing. And I don't want to end on just that negative note, but I definitely feel that when it comes to the partnership between India and Australia, it is a partnership of equals. It is a partnership that can go places simply because we're headed in the same direction at practically the same speed, but it is a partnership that has to be based on honesty.
Thank you, Suhasini, for that. I should apologize. In the flow of the conversation, I forgot to formally introduce you. So let me do that later, now as I should have done before. So I think Haidar is the national editor and diplomatic affairs editor of the Hindu. We've spoken a lot about the geopolitical context within which the India-Australia relationship is unfolding, and the big new visible sea, and how that shapes the nature of both our internal foreign policies and the nature of our relationship. But Dr. Varghese brought up a really important issue around our economies, the slowing down, so to say, of globalization, the increasing look within the borders, self-reliance. How does all of this shape the potential of our economic relationship? Ambassador Wadhwa, I'd like you to speak to this particular issue. By way of introduction, Ambassador Anil Wadhwa is the former ambassador and secretary, Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India. So over to you to reflect on the economic partnership.
So yes, I think the economic partnership is the one which has actually driven the India-Australia relationship really in the past 2 years, and led to cooperation in a number of other fields as well. Now, today's relationship is of course very diverse. Many of these relationships in other areas have sort of flown from the need for getting closer together economically. The economic relationship is driven and will be driven, in my view, by investments in the future. Services part is extremely important because the nature of the Australian economy and India's emphasis on services as well. Its emphasis on exporting, its services in particular sectors, which has been the case for some time now. But I think what has really surprised everyone is the speed with which we could sign the ECTA, which is quite a comprehensive agreement, even though it's called a limited agreement. And I think there is a, there I would like to slightly disagree with what Peter said, where, I think there is a desire, at least in India, to see that we sign a comprehensive agreement as quickly as possible. Because there's a lot of benefit that people in India see from that kind of a comprehensive agreement, especially if it encompasses the investment part. And plus, the sectoral MOUs that are under discussion already in terms of in education, for instance, or agriculture, those will actually be very, very helpful going forward in this comprehensive agreement. Diaspora, of course, as Peter said, has been an extremely important part of this economic relationship. They've actually done a lot to drive this, and they are growing in numbers. The student community should not be forgotten as well. Now we have more than 110,000 Indian students, 700,000 diaspora in Australia, and they're all, in fact, now diversifying, as far as their vocations are concerned in Australia. Many of them have established contacts back home. So moving forward, I see this as a very important part of this relationship. There are some certain disappointments which I would like to point out as well. I mean, India and Australia and Japan, for example, agreed on a resilient supply chain initiative. I don't think much has happened in terms of concrete action on the ground as far as that initiative is concerned. It was driven by Japan in the first place. But between Australia and India, I think more should be done bilaterally to see that we actually move forward at least in 2 or 3 important areas as demonstrators, because that will in turn help in our future comprehensive agreement. It will also help in the services side and what we do in finding new areas of cooperation on the economic side. Now, as far as India is concerned, there are a number of areas that have been looked at and analyzed, and we all know that there is a shortage of capital, capex, we call it in the Indian infrastructure sector in particular, where Australian super funds, for instance, have played a role already. They can play a much larger role going forward. Many of the larger companies have, especially those which have gone into infrastructure, road construction, toll roads, etc., have done well. That's a proven fact. And going forward, as India moves towards more and more emphasis on infrastructure and on issues like the PLI scheme, which has been opened up, I think more Australian companies should look at that as a possibility. One most important area, with the 2, in fact, most important areas that have been left out this discussion are defense. That's linked to geopolitics as well, because of course, India and Australia now take part in Malabar exercises. We've identified cyber and space and defense as areas of cooperation. There are separate agreements that have been signed. There's a logistics agreement in place. For the next step, if you have to actually take care of your concerns as far as China is concerned, whether it's the Pacific or whether it is the Indian Ocean, you have to look at how you can operate together in these sectors. Maritime domain awareness depends a lot on space situational awareness. There is a big scope for cooperation in that area. And Australia is laying a lot of emphasis on space right now, where I think the 2 strengths can be matched quite quickly. The defense cooperation, in my view, is going to give a solid basis going forward for the relationship in the future. Now we're looking at, in the short term, we're looking at what we can buy and trade and how we can reduce tariffs, etc., or what we could do by way of investments into each other's economies. But the long-term relationship will be built upon a strategic partnership in areas like defense and space and cyber technology. So I would say that while we have the identified areas, there is a very important issue of trying to do something together in concrete terms in these specific areas. So that creates a solid base for the two countries to move forward in other areas of cooperation. Now, of course, both sides have their own emphasis, so to speak. India looks at certain sectors where it can gain from Australia, especially in terms of commodities and things like rare earths, etc., for its e-mobility program and other industries, which are modern industries as we go forward. And Australia would be looking more at the agriculture sector, education and tourism, etc. So there are different nuances in this emphasis, but they can all be balanced because these are complementary economies. There's no competition here. And I don't see when there's no competition, then I think there is a commonality of interest and it should move forward quite easily, provided we can actually put our hearts to it and think about a longer term strategy. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we've had a very rich set of comments, and before we do another round, it'll be it's a good moment to pause and hear your reflections on what you've heard so far. So over to you to reflect and we take part.
Thanks, Yamini. There's some very difficult issues that have been raised in the rounds of comments. So let me start with Pratap's going to the heart of the matter, as I would expect he would. I don't think it's feasible to deny China. I think at best we can hope to arrive at a deterrence framework, not a denial framework. And the whole point of engage and constrain is to recognize that China is not a unidimensional power, that there are many areas on which we can and indeed should work together with China. And it's important, I think, that we have a reasonably clear understanding of what China is and what it isn't. So from an Australian perspective, I think it would be a mistake to start from the assumption that China is our enemy, or indeed China is our adversary. Our strategic concern about China really is the way in which its political character and its strategic ambition comes together. So a China that wants to become the predominant power in the Indo-Pacific, or to recreate the Middle Kingdom. I read with great interest Shan's analysis of the Middle Kingdom and historically what it was and what it wasn't. But at least in the Chinese eyes, the Middle Kingdom is essentially an arrangement where the primacy of China's interests preemptively conceded by others around it. Now, why we're uncomfortable with that strategic ambition is because we don't think it's a particularly good outcome to have a one-party authoritarian system as the predominant power and therefore the chief influencer, if you like, of the cultural, of the strategic norms of the region. That's different from seeing China as an expansionist threat to the Australian mainland. Now, should we be thinking more about restraining the US? Well, I think the really difficult question for Australia when it comes to the US are twofold. One is the retention of US primacy ultimately a vital Australian interest? And while I would argue that we have benefited enormously from US primacy, I wouldn't take the next step and say that preserving that primacy is a vital Australian interest, because I think it's an open question anyway, whether it can be preserved into the future. The second issue with the United States is just frankly its domestic dysfunction and what that might mean for the predictability of US strategic policy. I mean, the prospect of a Trump or a Trump-like person winning the next US presidential election raises some very serious questions about the strategic positioning of the United States. And to what extent then can Australia or should Australia frame its entire strategic position with that element of uncertainty? So it's not so much restraining the United States, because I don't think we need to be doing that. It's recognizing that the US strategic ambition on primacy may not be attainable, and therefore how do we deal with that? And factoring in now something which we frankly haven't had to do in the post-war period, the idea of the United States as an unpredictable strategic player. So on Suhasini's points, yes, I think we are moving towards a leaderless world. I think in some ways a multipolar world is a leaderless world in the sense that there isn't a single predominant power. I'm personally completely unconvinced that the future is a battle between autocracy and democracy. I think what's driving the behavior of China and Russia is not some shared ambition to dominate the world in terms of autocracy. I think certainly China wants to see a world that's safe for autocracies, but that's a very different proposition to the march of autocracies against the banner of democracy. I just think it's a simplifying and distracting way of thinking about the world. China in the South Pacific, it's a challenge for Australia. But here again, I mean, I think we need to be realistic about what are obtainable strategic objectives and what are not obtainable. I think the idea of denying China any presence in the South Pacific, or thinking that we can veto the choice of South Pacific countries to have dealings with China, is pie in the sky. The very best that we can hope for, and what we should be working very hard at achieving, is that Australia is the partner of first choice for all of the countries in the South Pacific. And I think we've got the wherewithal to actually make that happen. I think if you look at the nature of our connections, which are multidimensional in the South Pacific, and contrasted with the rather narrow base of offerings that China can have, we are able to do that. On the Quad, I mean, I agree, Suhasini, that the Quad hasn't changed the world. I actually think it's a mistake for the Quad to go down a broad, multilateral, public goods agenda. I think if the Quad is to do what it's supposed to do, which is really to be an element in the management of China, it needs at some point to have a harder strategic edge to it. In fact, if I were sitting in Beijing, I think the idea of the Quad, focusing on vaccines and other public goods is terrific. It will water down the strategic edge that at some point the Quad needs to have. And yes, we're an alliance and India isn't, and I don't think either of those things are going to change. No matter what our ultimate judgments are on US primacy and unpredictability, there is no question that the alliance for us is on balance a benefit. It's a benefit in terms of technology. It's a benefit in terms of at least factoring in the deterrent capability. If you are thinking about doing something against Australia, at the very least, you're going to have to factor in what the United States position would be. So I don't see us ditching the alliance, whatever reservations we may have about those other two issues. And on Anil's points, yeah, absolutely. I think there is a desire on both sides to conclude the final FTA as quickly as possible. The only point I'd make is that between desire and consummation often is a gap, and that will relate to just the difficulty of the issues that we're dealing with. I think investment is the missing piece in our bilateral economic relationship. We need to be doing more to get Australian investment into India. I think the more we can link investment and trade, the stronger the base for the relationship. I think Anil's own Australian economic strategy, did all of us a service by focusing on some sectors which up to then had not received the attention they should have, including space and cyber and critical minerals. Defense is an area which will grow. I'm not sure exactly what the points of commonality are going to be, but both Australia and India are moving down a path of expanding their domestic defense capability. Australia, like India, has been by and large an importer of defense technology, and at least in the maritime area, we're trying to build our own capability. Maybe we should have started with something less complicated than nuclear submarines, but that's the direction in which we're heading.
Thank you. We'll have another round of responses from the panel, and while we do that, just a request, especially to the audience on Zoom, if you have any questions, just place them on the Zoom Q&A box, and we'll try and integrate them into the rounds as we go. So it's much too tempting not to start with you again, Pratap, just to respond to Peter's remarks. Denial versus deterrence, more deterrence than denial, really, that we are perhaps moving into a leaderless world, and that's perhaps something we need to think about a little bit more. But also just wanted you to reflect a little bit on the whole self-reliance globalization story, because that is also part of what's shaping the contours in which this relationship is being built.
Yeah. And thanks, Peter, as always, in your clarifications. They're so educated for us, and that's the temptation to always draw you out with the provocation. Although I do think, actually, I mean, I'm not an expert in this, but I think Washington still talks the language of denial, and you could say that they have to in some ways, but I think both the rhetoric, the discourse, the terms that are actually used, I think still are largely premised on that. And that's why I think the kind of pushback from countries like Australia, so what are realistic objectives here, might actually be perhaps more consequential than otherwise would have been. Just to shift tacks a bit on this kind of the economic framework. So, I read your wonderful report on the kind of India economic opportunities that Ambassador Wadhwa has as well. And they're both splendid. I mean, they're really quite extraordinary, the depth in which you kind of engage with different sectors and states. I have to confess, I was struck by one thing, which is both reports are premised on a manufacturing pessimism. And I wonder whether that was just deliberate or that is just the state of the things, which is, a lot of the stuff is still services, it's still education, it's raw materials, it's critical minerals, which you could say is a component of manufacturing, but not the actual sort of thing. And when it comes to kind of, I think the point Ambassador Wadhwa made about resilient supply chains, right? I mean, resilient supply chains, you have to, in a sense, be in the thick of lots of manufacturing processes. You have to have some stuff to offer the world in some ways. And it seemed to me that I think the manufacturing bottleneck, actually on both sides, actually, not just India, but actually in Australia as well, actually makes this relationship in some senses, while the numbers look good, 27 billion to whatever, 45 billion in 5 years, without the strong manufacturing base, it's very difficult to see them as central to any resilient supply chain story. I mean, that's something for India and Australia to think about, even independently of the bilateral relationship. There's the news item today. I don't know whether it's actually true, but there is this rare alliance. 12 countries have got together. India is not yet part of it, and that seems to suggest that there is still, as Suhasini said, a lot of confusion about what the economic footprint of any of these relationships is going to be in a broader regional context. Is it time to go even more ambitious? I mean, if the cost of solar is going to, be close to zero, is it time to think of a pan-Asia grid, for example? Something which Australia and India could, in a sense, cooperate on. In a way, I'm kind of pushing you in a little bit two directions. One, whether the manufacturing pessimism of both reports was actually conscious. That's your objective assessment that for the next 5 to 7 years, you don't see as much happening there. And therefore, all the stuff on resilient supply chains, even defense cooperation, manufacturing cooperation will be, I think those goals will be realistic to attain. But secondly, if we are actually thinking of a kind of regional architecture, and if you want to ask the question, why should Indonesia or Thailand or any other country in the region, as you rightly said, Australia is the country of first choice in some ways. If you want to strengthen that, it's hard to think of doing that without a much bigger push on public goods in the region and a much bigger push on, in a sense, their technology and energy needs. And from that point of view, actually the bilateral thing looks quite unambitious. It takes even in education, frankly. I mean, I know in Quad there is this kind of technology initiative. We are doing much more on R&D. But fundamentally, whether any other country comes to India or Australia in the region will depend on whether we are at the frontier of R&D or not. And I wonder whether that's an area where actually our ambition should be much higher than it is. And that could actually be good for India because it could actually catalyze, I think, a much deeper debate on R&D than it is actually on at the moment.
Thank you. So, Suhasini, if I could ask you to reflect on this, in a sense, is the relationship in its current framing far less ambitious than it can be, and it ought to be, particularly in the context of the issues that you brought up too about the regional configurations and the particular economic context within the region, both SAARC and for Australia?
No, definitely. I mean, if our ambitions for a good few decades were really around the 3 C's, that they were extremely low to start with. And it is true, when I first started reading about India-Australia relations, practically every Google search I did just threw up things like cricket or students, of course, which, it's an important relationship between. I think there are 2 or 3 reasons why the ambition of our relationship has not caught up with the potential. One, of course, I think it is Stephen Smith who used to say all the time that Chennai is closer to Perth than it is to Tokyo or Seoul or any of the other countries in that part of the region, and yet our connectivity has been a real challenge. Even when we did start up, direct flights and all of that, I think COVID was a great disruptor over there. But the truth is that Australia feels like the other side of the world for India, and I do think that for Australians too, that has been a huge challenge. The fact that not enough push was made when it came to connectivity. The second part is that eventually dealing with different aggregations of population, if you like. Ours is a very densely populated country. Australia does not have that. But we're each of us separately grappling with the challenge of a really youthful population. And therefore, if we are going to look at the future is going to be in things we are not already doing. Pratap mentioned the mineral coalition that India is not a part of. It's as if we have jumped onto that bus a little late. But there are other areas, health. I think the idea of having remote medicine, which is something Australia and India have been speaking about, should really move much faster. When it came to the ECTA as well, many of the areas where we have not been able to find agreement are areas where actually we should be looking much clearer at, I'm not even getting into the whole dairy question because that has become such a huge, complex sort of unmovable object. But, on the other hand, we did move on alcohol, beer and wine, which is important. But I think what has been happening is there is a refusal to look at the areas in the future that we could actually work together on much more. Food security was one part of that. Another area where I really think we can work together is on the idea of harnessing the youthful populations into jobs. Australia has actually its leaps and bounds ahead of other countries in its ability to map and do futuristic assessments of the job markets, how you can ensure that people are actually studying what they might find a job in. This is something India could learn a lot more from. So there are areas, there's of course renewable energy, and that's a whole different story, and that big sea of coal hopefully will go, will not be the thing binding us, although right now it is an important factor. So I think if we're looking at ambition, the ambitions that we can think of are already behind us. We need to look at a new Australia and a new India, if I may use those terms, in terms of where our ambitions really lie. The strategic aspect almost comes together more easily because we have so much in common. And I think Anil put it very nicely when he said the lack of competition means actually we have a lot of common interests over there.
Ambassador Wadhwa, your reflections, both on why we set limits to our ambition in the bilateral and what are the levers for moving forward. I know you mentioned some of them in your earlier remarks, but how do we move forward?
So I think I'll pick up that point which Pratap made about manufacturing. That the strategies which have been written are sort of underwhelming as far as the emphasis on manufacturing is concerned. But I think it's also a reflection of what was possible at that point in time when these strategies were written. Now, of course, we move forward. I did mention, things like the PLI scheme, etc. The emphasis that India is putting now on the manufacturing side. And there is subsequently, and I've spoken about it, there's been a much more opening up of opportunity for both India and Australia in the manufacturing sector. So if the strategy were to be written today, I'm sure there would be much more of it in that. Now, of course, the Australian side, Peter, has been given a chance to revise his strategy. We haven't done that. I don't see that happening either in the near future. But that's a fact. There is a change in circumstances. The second issue is about the rare earth alliance. We are in India. We've been quite slow, in my opinion, in moving towards participation in these arrangements as far as rare earths are concerned. In fact, I think the Indian government has moved a little slowly also in terms of acquisitions, which it needs to do. It's a little too late, in my opinion, to actually move forward, which it could have done much more if it was a little earlier. In Australia, for instance, we have now the windows have closed quite a bit, so whatever is left to be done will be done. But of course, if both sides had come together, much more earlier, then things could have been better. I don't see the coal story ending, despite the pressure of environment between India and Australia very soon. And that is for various reasons. I think one is because the amount of energy that you need, at least in India, to actually bridge the gap between the needs of development and production, etc., that cannot be met by the alternatives which are on the table right now. And I was speaking to the people who are involved in the power sector, for example, while I was doing this report, it clearly came out that as far as India is concerned, this dependency is there for at least a couple of decades, not more. And so this dependence on Australia and the fact that we have now zero tariff on coal, once the agreement goes into effect, is actually going to create this dependency and strengthen it even further. So we leave the environment aside. So, okay, that's the case. Peter, 2 or 3 important points, geopolitics, and I think he mentioned quite importantly the rebalancing that Australia will have to look at going forward, and how the balance between forward defense and the defense of Australia will happen inevitably as Southern Pacific. I foresee something similar, which is going to happen in the Indian Ocean. as far as India is concerned. And that's a commonality that we have because we cannot rule out the expansion of China into the Pacific or the Indian Ocean, given the expansion of naval power, which will happen going forward, as China would like to project itself as a growing power. And he's absolutely right when he says that there's no point trying to deny access to a country like China. What we should be doing is actually presenting ourselves as a credible first country of choice in our region. And we can only do that if we actually connect with the needs of the countries who are in our neighborhood, both in case of India as well as in the case of the Pacific countries, which have been very close to Australia in the past. And here again, I would think that countries of the Quad, for instance, can or should put together all their resources, because we have bilateral programs which we implement individually on a bilateral basis. These resources should be pooled together, in my view, and they should be then utilized for a fewer number of projects which actually are impactful, instead of spreading them out very thin on development projects which won't even impact in the longer term. So that's one area of cooperation that I foresee. Second point that I wanted to comment on, which you made, was about the China-Russia relationship and how it will put a limiter on India. And that's precisely the reason why I think Suhasini made this point that India is part of a number of plurilateral groupings at the same time. So we are not in an alliance, but at the same time, we are taking part in similar kind of exercises or cooperating on vaccine or on counterterrorism with a number of groupings at the same time. That's precisely the dilemma that India has at the moment. Because of the legacy of dependency of weaponry as far as the Russians are concerned. Now, if you look at the current situation on the border, where you have a standoff, which is continuing, it's actually deepening in my view. You actually have that dependency on the supplies. If you look around, as far as India is concerned, there is no credible alternative which is there at the moment. I mean, there is, of course, this desire to have this self-sufficiency as far as Indian defense industry is concerned. It's all going to take time. So in the near future, given the current scenario, all these options have to be open as far as India is concerned. And therefore, you see that manifesting itself in this policy. But I completely agree with Peter there as far as the United States is concerned. It does cause a pinprick, but of course, this has been something which has been discussed quite in detail with the United States as well. Third issue is on the multilateral side, which you mentioned, Peter. It's about how institutional or bodies like APEC or East Asia Summit or ARF can be used for the strategy of containing China, so to speak. I think it's been proved that these institutions have not worked in the past because they've become talk shops. What happens with delegations is that they make a long speech and that's it. There's no discussion because the host, whichever is the host country, normally refrains from causing any issues or problems because they're the hosts of that meeting. So they don't even, the Chinese do not even allow a discussion to take place. They put pressure in a number of cases. And I've seen that myself because I've taken part in at least 2 or 3 of these. And it doesn't work at all. The discussion is not meaningful. At the most, you have an exchange on the floor between the United States and the US delegation, where the United States delegation is told, but you're not even part of the region. So why are you interfering in the region? And it's a question which is so important, like the South China Sea, where the Chinese occupation takes place or consolidation takes place, but you can't in a body like East Asia Summit or the ARF actually discuss this in greater detail. So you need plurilateral groupings. And there, I think to an extent, I agree with you that yes, you need the security edge in the Quad, but there are also the interests of the ASEAN countries, which you got to take care of. And unless the Quad is seen as doing something for the common good, it will not be acceptable to the region. So they'll see that as another extraterritorial imposition and a burden, so to speak, to deal with as far as the strategic politics and the evolution of the geopolitics in the region is concerned. So to that extent, I think it served that purpose. But I would agree with you that I think in practical terms, the Quad should actually concentrate on the strategic joint working groups rather than spread itself out very thin, and it has a concrete agenda. And I think the one initiative that should have succeeded on vaccines has been delayed. So the Quad should have actually reviewed that in time to get all the approvals in place, which you should have done much earlier, been delayed for 6 months. That would be a demonstrator of what the Quad can actually achieve. Thank you.
Thank you. Would you like to respond very quickly, and then we can open it up for questions?
So on manufacturing pessimism, look, I think it's fair comment, Pratap. Analysis always needs to be updated. And when we were writing the India economic strategy was 5 years ago, as it was written, or since it was published, we probably didn't put much weight on manufacturing. I think India's own positioning since then has changed significantly, partly because the investment in infrastructure has cleared some of the roadblocks to competitive advantage in manufacturing. I mean, India always had labor arbitrage. Infrastructure has given it an edge, but also because part of deglobalization and the relocation of supply chains opens up an opportunity for India that wasn't there before the China issue became what it has become. So for all of those reasons, I think manufacturing is going to be a bigger part of the India story, and therefore a bigger part of what other countries might be able to do with India. And certainly from an employment point of view, it's crucial for India's future. On technology and energy, I mean, we had quite a lot in our report on innovation and technology. I've just spent 3 days talking to my universities, University of Queensland partners in Delhi, and particularly the relationship we have with Delhi IIT. And it's clear to me that this innovation connection is going to work its way through a whole lot of things that we do in India, and it'll be much more prominent in the way in which we engage. And India is facing a big deficit on research capability, and that need for an indigenous research capability is only going to grow. And I think Australia can work with India along with many other countries on achieving that, and that's going to be an important part of it. I think energy, you're probably right. The emphasis we gave on energy tended not to be towards the high-tech end of energy and the renewable side, and we could do more there. I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with this very ambitious project in the Northern Territory to export solar power to Singapore. I mean, so those kinds of things may have an echo in what we can do with India. And if nuclear comes back, nuclear energy, that is, comes back on the agenda in Australia and in a different way in India, that may be another energy opportunity. I think Suhasini is absolutely right to say that if you're going to imagine the future, maybe you can be more ambitious in terms of how different the future can be. But I think the challenge with any kind of strategy setting and policy making is that you're in the end often constrained by an extrapolation from the current. It's very hard to completely reinvent and reimagine a future. You've always got to be looking for connecting thread to the current, and that's always going to make you a little bit more conservative, I think, than what you might otherwise be. And Anil's points, look, on regional institutions, I guess my argument is don't use regional institutions for the constraining agenda. Use them for the engaging agenda, and use other mechanisms for the constraining agenda, including the plurilateral groups. And the Quad and public goods, there is an ASEAN angle, but I think you can overstate the ASEAN angle. ASEAN, in my sense, is not uncomfortable with the Quad. I mean, ASEANs are very sophisticated in navigating great power rivalry. They are extremely uncomfortable with any suggestion that they be dragged into anything that has to do with the major power relationships. But I think, frankly, they'd be quite happy to see the Quad develop as long as we don't cross that line.
Thank you. So open to questions, comments, and also to the Zoom audience if you would like to put something up on the Q&A. Go ahead. So we'll take maybe a cluster of 4 or 5 questions, and then we can do one more round.
Thank you for the recognition. Hi, my name is Arman. I'm a first-year student of political science at Delhi University. And first of all, I would like to thank everyone here for a very enriching discussion. And my question really is about a broader geopolitical dialectic, which I feel we've touched upon, but which I feel is very relevant to the broader India-Australia relationship. So there is this idea of the current status quo being a world between orders, which is something even a recent CPR report has spoken about. And we see a rapidly shifting balance of power, which makes it seem like, especially given the Ukrainian crisis, that these powers are just muddling along from crisis to crisis, and there is a sort of a dissatisfaction within the international system. A recent article by Ambassador Shiv Shankar Menon called it very interestingly, motion without movement. So this concept of motion without movement is something which I would like to get your views on. Dr. Mehta has pointed out that the international arena hasn't been able to create a denial strategy, and that's where the concept of deterrence came in. And the fact that the threat of escalation does not come only from China, but from other powers as well. So reconciliation of this particular dilemma would be something closer to movement rather than mere motion. And so my question really is, can we transcend this, given the fact that we have such a shaky status quo, can we transcend this motion-driven world to reach one driven by movement, insofar as we connote movement as a movement towards the idea of a more stable equilibrium in the world order rather than the shaking one we see at present? And I would particularly like to put this to Professor Mehta and to Mr. Varghese, because you've touched upon the idea of deterrence and denial.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Jitendra Bisht. I belong to the Center for Progressive Studies. We're a really, really young research initiative just out of Jammu and Kashmir. So I'd like to add one more C to that list. That's climate change. And you touched briefly on that. I'm not sure, I mean, there was no substantial discussion on it, but I think we're easily crossing 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels by the end of the century. And, given most of the countries in the Indo-Pacific region are developing economies, and they're not going to reach peak emissions in the next 2 decades easily. Hello. Yeah. So given that, and so that what that makes climate change is possibly the greatest existential threat to these economies, along with China maybe. Although I'm going to let you guys decide, whoever wants to respond, which one is more of an existential threat in the long term. So now we have to deal with substantial human security issues in that case. And the more the region, and this is related to security in general also, right? Regional security issues, since the more the region remains insecure, and the more there is great power rivalry in the region, the lesser the ability, it basically impacts the ability of these states to deal with adverse climate impacts in the long term, because you need deep emissions cuts. And these carbon capture technologies are costly. India's budget doesn't fit that. So what do you do in this case as, responsible powers, two of the most responsible powers in the region, India and Australia? How do you bring China on the table?
Anyone else?
Hello, my name is N.K. Sagar. My question to the Mr. Peter, that you have discussed a lot about manufacturing, but in the event of best of education and best of your relations with US and Europe, why you are lagging? I'm just putting straight question, not here and there. Why, the Australians need submarines, aeroplanes, and many things for their, security point of view and defense. Why the country is lagging behind in spite of all wealth, minerals, and whatnot? You are one of the richest country in the world. So what is lagging behind in creating manufacturing? Because, the Chinese people have invited most of the Japanese company to their, country to establish a China of techno best now. So how far we can see that Australia can get to this phase of, like India, we don't have much of technology and education, but Australia does have. Thank you very much.
Shall we take quick responses to this round of questions before we open it up again?
Okay, motion without movement. It's a
Ah.
terrific phrase, and I think it's a pretty accurate phrase. I mean, the reality is, as you, I think, acknowledged in your question, that we are in a period of extended transition between an order which is now gone and a new order which is yet to be established. And I think it's going to take us quite a long time before we find a settling point in this new strategic equilibrium that we're going to need. And so part of that is going to turn on the question of how much common ground or conceded common ground will the US and China be able to find. So at the moment, it's a very binary kind of discussion. But the reality is that unless there is some stabilizer in the relationship, which has to include an acknowledgement up to a point of common ground or legitimate interests, we're not going to get there. So I think if indeed we are in a period of motion without movement, we're probably going to be there for a little while yet. On climate change in China, well, I don't see China as an existential threat. I mean, China is a challenge in all sorts of very serious ways, but it's not an existential threat. And for us to properly deal with climate change, we are going to need a very large measure of global cooperation. And that means China and other big emitters are going to have to be part of that. Ultimately, I think technology will have to play a very big role. The transition to a zero carbon economy is an incredibly complicated exercise. And even for countries like Australia, which has this extraordinary advantage of having been a big player in the fossil fuel sector, we also have the attributes and the luck and the natural resources to be a big player in the renewables economy. But even there, the transition for us is going to be complicated. And on manufacturing in Australia, well, I mean, I'm still a believer in the very old-fashioned concept of comparative advantage. And for Australia, comparative advantage in manufacturing is going to come in niche advanced manufacturing, because we don't have the low labor cost structure that large-scale manufacturing requires. And so I think it's unlikely that Australia will move towards large-scale manufacturing as opposed to niche advanced manufacturing. it's still a reasonably significant component of our exports, actually. I mean, if people think of Australia as just a raw materials exporter, but in fact, our services exports and our manufacturing exports are quite significant proportions of our overall exports.
Just one quick thought to your very large question, just to make life a little bit more miserable. When we're talking about transitions between orders, my own sense is that there is actually an internal legitimation crisis in pretty much every part of the world, right? The party state in China has to think about what form of nationalism and national ambition, in a sense, it needs for the stability of its internal legitimation order. Liberal democracy, though more resilient, is going through its own issues. And of course, the region between, in a sense, Pakistan and Turkey, West Asia, in a sense, there's a kind of foundational question that's still up for grabs. And the driver is actually going to be more how these internal crises are resolved, right? It's actually not going to be just an external, because what your interests are and what you hope to project as your interests and values are going to be in part a function, in a sense, of what kind of society you think you want to live in. And I think that's what gives added layer of uncertainty to all this, right? The form that Russian nationalism takes. I mean, frankly, it was a pretty stable equilibrium. I mean, there's no particular reason Russia needs to go and, try and bomb a country out of existence at this point. I don't think it's not even in Russian interest, right? But there is a particular ideological ambition connected to its own internal legitimation crisis. The same is going to happen with Taiwan or the South China Sea. So I actually think in the end, the bigger drivers are actually going to be those domestic legitimation things, not so much as it were. I think the international system rules game is always going to be the icing on the cake, an expression of that, rather than the principal driver.
Thanks. Suhasini, Anil, would you like to comment on?
No, actually, I mean, I think both have been answered in a sense. There's not much one can say in terms of where the geopolitical situation is going, simply because we're living in very different times. I remember 5 years ago, I had this theory that I used to test on absolutely every kind of international event or every bilateral relationship, which was in the Trump era, which was essentially that the world could be explained by three basic phenomena. One was the rise of China. The second was the retrenchment of the United States, and certainly, the Trump era of walking out of every international multilateral sphere. And the third was the rise of populism. And already 5 years later, we're seeing these have shifted in terms of how the world is seeing them. I don't think that we are really able to tell what is going to happen. We don't know when the next COVID-like phenomenon is going to come around. So I think we have to go back at an issue, and I think some of what Pratap saying, we have to know what we are and work from there, work from the idea of, some of it will mean turning more Atmanirbhar, if you like. But a lot of it is going to be really about understanding that one has limitations. I wasn't able to ask this question earlier, but since Peter is here, I do want to ask, one of the other big shifts has been the idea that India went into this negotiation with ASEAN, with Australia, and the rest of them for the RCEP. And then 4 years ago walked out of that. What kind of impact has that had really on the India-Australia relationship as well? Because I can see, when you're looking even at the EFTA that has been negotiated now, rules of origin is an issue.
Well, I mean, nothing I say reflects what the Australian government thinks. So, but look, like a lot of other countries, we were disappointed that India, in the end, decided it wouldn't sign on to RCEP. We had been very hopeful for a period that India was pretty close to doing it, but it made a different judgment. I mean, I've always had the view that India does best when it is most open. both domestically and externally from an economic point of view, and RCEP would have been consistent with that trajectory. Since then, of course, India has expressed a very strong interest in negotiating more bilateral FTAs, and we've been a beneficiary of that in being able to get a pretty impressive, albeit interim agreement. So the fact that that reflects a continuing interest in trade liberalization and trade engagement, I think is very, very positive thing.
One question which was left out was on climate change. So I completely agree with the fact that it is actually an existence. Because if you look at countries, especially who are surrounded by water, the smaller countries, for them, it's really a life and death question. And that therefore is an important issue for the Pacific Island states. For a country like Maldives, for example, they're small countries, so their voice is not so powerful. Yet, as a bloc, they're quite powerful and they voice their concerns quite clearly. In fact, it's come to a stage where actually they are accusing the other countries of not doing enough as far as climate change is concerned. So they're actually facing something which we never imagined can happen. Not only them, but we also have, you just look at what is happening this year in terms of the extreme hot weather. Italy has run out of water, northern Italy has run out of water. Climate change has brought about different rainfall patterns. It's going to affect food production, economic security, food security, and ultimately in a country like India with 1.4 billion people, for instance, if there is a water crisis, you have slow down in everything else. So it is something that countries have to pay much more attention to. The imperatives of development of what is happening around the Ukraine war, for instance, people have forgotten about what this issue is about, and there are other priorities which have come up. And I just wish that people don't take their eyes off the ball as we move forward. It's a very important issue. And I completely agree that this is something that should not be lost sight of. And that's why I made that particular comment about coal, where in the relationship, this is an important component going forward. We can't get rid of it, but actually, we have to make sure that you use techniques which do not, we actually mitigate the emissions problem.
I think we have time for just one last round. We'll take 2 questions from here and I'll take 1 from the audience. I'm going to privilege the younger 2 colleagues at the back and then I'll come to you. So.
Hi, good evening to the panel. My question is mainly to Dr. Varghese and Ms. Haidar. Since we were talking about value-based interests and strategic interests, actually, one of the differences that I see is perhaps looking at China's behavior around, say, South China Sea and, what we call a rowdy behavior in the sea. So there we see that while both India and Australia have a common interest in values, both have been, propagating the rights of free navigation and a free open seas. But at the same time, looking at the strategic interests, they're different. While India has been silent about, or just signaling about China's presence, Australia has been active in denying any, legal nature of China's presence there. So with all the risks involved and with all of, India's considerations and aspirations, do you think that it is time for India to perhaps realign this gap that exists between, its value-based interest and its strategic interest?
Then gentleman behind you.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for this wonderful session. So I have a question come observation. So it's really interesting because India and Australia shares a host of interest when it comes to Indo-Pacific or this China issue. So my observation is that we cannot afford to ignore the elephant in the room, that is China. So while we are talking, China is the talk of the town with respect to Taiwan. So both the countries are among the most important players in the Indo-Pacific. So, but the idea of Indo-Pacific in itself is something to counter China. So in order to realize this objective, what I believe is to engage ourselves more and more with the Southeast Asian countries in general and ASEAN in particular. And what Mr. Peter has said that ASEAN has is not at all uncomfortable when it's come to Kuwait. So how are we going to realize the dream or the objective of Indo-Pacific with respect to taking these reasons together? Like how India or Australia view this reason with respect to Indo-Pacific? That's my question. Thank you so much.
Very quick last comment from you.
Thank you, ma'am. I'd like to make some observations, please. Small question at the end. I'm very optimistic about the India-Australia relations because if you see the progress, it's grown so well so far. At the same way as we have the CIS, the Commonwealth, the BRICS, EU, African states, and Islamic states. They're all doing well. There's no, we shouldn't have been doubt that the Commonwealth cousins wouldn't do well. They're on the same lines as we have relations with Britain, Canada, US, and to some extent Russia and China as well. We have relations that are going to go down. The reason being, China is a neighbor. Russia, we have a fine relation of the history of relations so far. It's going to grow. The same is with Australia. It's going to grow as far as I know. It's not going to go down anyway. Now, the question is, the China is coming time and again in the question. It's an interdependent world, mind you. Nobody can afford to go in a long conflict. There could be small conflict, but nobody can afford to go for the long conflict, and nobody will allow it. And they can't afford it because the economy wouldn't allow it to go that far. It could be small, and that is one. Right. My question now. The question, my contribution to the over here. One point I've been missed out. How we promote the relation between China and Australia. There was a lot I could have said, but I want to stop it with a small question. It's my contribution. I've traveled all over the world. It was only possible that there were youth hostels all over the world. I could only travel. I could afford my travel, but not my accommodation. The same thing is hampering over here. The youth on both sides. It's a far away place. Perhaps they can afford it to travel, but they can't afford that. The problem is with the tourist industry, that is the hotels. They are coming in the way. If we make a chain of youth hostels all over Australia and India, maybe youth will be able to travel, and that could be final relations in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. So over to you, Pratap, both for responses and quick last comments before we close.
Okay, well, very quickly, I don't think it's for me to comment on any perceived gap between values and strategy in Indian policy. All I'd say is vis-a-vis China and the South China Sea, maybe India's a bit more adept at diplomacy in keeping a more low-key explanation of its position than Australia. On the Indo-Pacific, look, I've never seen the Indo-Pacific as all about China. When we were, making this construct and shift from Asia-Pacific to Indo-Pacific, the two key drivers were, one, a recognition that the strategic environment of the future was going to be overwhelmingly a maritime environment, and that particularly for a country like Australia, which faces two oceans, you couldn't really completely hermetically seal Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean, and so it made sense for an Indo-Pacific construct. And frankly, the second driver was recognizing India's position in the strategic matrix of the region, because the Asia-Pacific construct had a rather ambivalent position for India, whereas the Indo-Pacific concept makes it very clear where India sits. Now, Southeast Asia is hugely important to the region, hugely important for the concept of the Indo-Pacific. It's our strategic hinterland. We want to put a lot more emphasis on building that relationship with Southeast Asia. We want to have a relationship which doesn't start with putting pressure on them to make a choice between the US and China. Because if you want a strained relationship with Southeast Asia, that's the best place to start. So we'll be going in a slightly different direction. On China and Australia, well, look, we do need to stabilize the relationship. I think that's recognized. I think it's probably now recognized on both sides. My view, it's a personal view, is that we should hold fast to the principles and ditch the microphone, either the megaphone, and that would help.
Thank you. Any last comments from both of you?
I think there was this question about, again, the Indo-Pacific relationship, etc., which we just partly answered. But I think, when the discussions took place in the Quad about what constitutes the Indo-Pacific, and that was the beginning of it, 2017, once it was revived, it was quite clear that there were interests which were not commensurate with the geographical area of what India saw the Indo-Pacific as. And also there are capacity constraints as far as different countries are concerned. So of course, India would say that, it stretches from the Pacific down to the coast of Africa. United States looked at in segments, and Australian interests would stop somewhere in Sri Lanka, all the way on the east coast of India. So, this is now quite well understood that everyone has a part to play, and the interests cannot be similar. And so you have to have shared responsibility, and that's now quite settled.
Common but differentiated and shared. Nice idea with lots of internal tensions, but probably the way to manage this very complex world. So I think, did you want to quickly come?
The question asked on the value-based interest and strategic interest, and then Peter very diplomatically said he couldn't speak to India's choices. The truth is that when you say India is silent on what is happening in the South China Sea, I would say India is silent about what is happening at the line of actual control. So the idea is that we would speak up over there. Secondly, when it comes to the Taiwan crisis, it is not a country that India recognizes. When India recognizes Ukraine and it got invaded, India did not make a statement about that. The larger point I'm trying to make is that there is a huge difference in what we think our values are and where our values actually do lie. And if that was not the case, India would find it in itself, and by that I'm not just criticizing the government, to actually say what's wrong is wrong. And I'm talking about the Russia-Ukraine situation. And when it comes to India building up more with Southeast Asia and ASEAN, it is actually some of you, I think, were there last week at this conversation we were having on the Indo-Pacific circle, and it is actually baffling when you think of the history that India has had with Southeast Asian countries and where we are today. And of course, if you haven't read Ambassador Saran's book on these mandalas, as he puts it, you really are missing out. But the truth is, I think Napoleon said, show me a country's geography and I'll tell you its history. The fact is, it is our history, but in a certain sense, we have given it up in the present, and I certainly hope that the future will be different.
Thank you. It sort of gets to the heart of what has been such a fascinating conversation amidst very, very complex and shifting contours of geopolitics, complexities of the internal logics of countries as they are unfolding to, which I think will eventually play into resolving where the international order will find itself. And amidst all of this, we have existential crises like climate change, not so existential crises, but critical, not quite critical crises as such, but challenges around the nature of China, Russia, and its own ambitions of all of which shape the contours of the India-Australia relationship. I think this has been a fascinating conversation, a masterclass in geopolitics and geoeconomics, and as well as a recognition that maybe the future of this relationship lies in deeper and greater ambition. So I hope this is the start of more more thinking on the ambitious agenda, and look forward to more such interactions. And thank you once again, Peter, for taking the time to be with us here at CPR. It really is a privilege. Thank you, High Commissioner. Thank you, Sarah, for being here and for giving us the opportunity to host this, and to all our panelists for taking the time. We have some refreshments outside, so I hope you'll all join us for a little bit more, just to chat casually about the ambitions of this relationship as we go forward.